Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review, and we have up right now Noah Gregor. Noah Gregor's history with the San Jose Sharks isn't particularly extensive. He was drafted back in the 4th round of 2016, and as like most of these late round picks, he wasn't really a name that jumped off the page at all. Probably someone who would be relatively forgettable. He ended up going back to juniors, obviously, because at a 4th rounder, you're not usually good enough to make the team right out of the draft, and he had some pretty solid seasons in the WHL, playing especially at the ages of 19 and then as an overager at the age of 20. He was able to put up a lot of points, but that doesn't necessarily separate him from the competition, and so it still wasn't necessarily expected that he'd be able to make the Sharks. But during the 1920 season, he did well enough in the AHL that he managed to make it to the NHL and play actually a decent amount of games with the Sharks, close to 30, while putting up about 5 points. In the following season, so just last year, the 2021 season, he played 30 games, 5 goals, 1 assist for 6 points. Over a full 82-game season, that would put him on pace for about 16 points, which is half decent for a 4th liner. But that's really all that was thought about Noah Gregor. It didn't really seem like he had much more of a ceiling to go than that. It felt as though he would be like a pretty good AHL player and maybe a decent 4th liner for the team into the future, and likely wouldn't be a part of this team all that much, or at least not a big part. And the beginning of this season kind of continued with that. In fact, Noah Gregor was not good enough to make the San Jose Sharks right out of training camp, and instead stuck with the Barracuda for the first month and a half of the season. It was only after a couple of injuries took hold where the Sharks had to make a call-up, and Noah Gregor came up, and he left a mark, because once he got called up, he never got sent back down. Ended up doubling up on his career high in terms of games played with 63, and also improved quite significantly in terms of points. 8 goals, 15 assists for 23 points, which over a full 82-game season would amount to about 30 points. Almost doubling what would have been his career high in a full 82-game season. And the thing that also is there for Noah Gregor, and what many Sharks fans would know if they had been watching Noah Gregor, was kind of this running joke that went on with him, especially in the first, honestly, like 3 quarters of the season, which was that Noah Gregor, in pretty much every single game that he would play, or almost every single game that he would play, he would get a grade A chance, maybe even multiple grade A chances, but most of the time, I'd say about 90% of the time, he would fail to actually score on them. There was a point where he probably could have easily had 7 or 8 goals on the season while he was still sitting at just 1. That was really his major issue for the first large part of the season. He just didn't have any finish to his game. And the next point that I'm actually going to make is going to even tie into his plus minus, which obviously here looks extremely bad at a minus 21. You see, the thing here about Noah Gregor is that when it comes to a minus 21, yeah, you could always make the sort of point that on a bad team, the plus minus is going to be deflated like this. And then, of course, there are certain situations where players will have an even lower plus minus because they're on the ice for a lot of 6-on-5 empty net goals against. But Gregor isn't actually part of that situation. And so just being on a bad team definitely does not explain why he is a minus 21. But what might actually do so is the fact that Noah Gregor constantly would bounce around between lines this entire season. In fact, he was the one San Jose Sharks forward who had the least consistent line mates on the entire team. To put this into perspective, we have players like Timo Meier, who had a specific line with Hertl and Barabanov for about 34% of his even strength ice time. Similar for Tomas Hertl, who had over 30% with those same 2 players. Logan Couture, who also bounced around a decent amount, still played about 25% of the season with Meier and Dahlin. And the same goes for players like Bonino and Cogliano and Balcers and Nieto. All of these players had at least 20% of their ice time at even strength with set line mates. Noah Gregor was extremely different from that. He played with Tomas Hertl and Alex Barabanov as his most frequent line mates for only 12.5% of his even strength ice time. That means 1/8 of his ice time was spent with those two sort of same line mates, and more often than not, he was just bouncing around between the first and the fourth lines. And so why this ties into maybe a slightly lowered or heavily lowered, you could say, plus minus, and potentially missing out on some of those goals and points, well, he could never really develop chemistry with anybody. And while offensively, you can still sort of individually make a big offensive play to score yourself a goal or get an assist here or there, on the defensive side of things, it's a lot more difficult to defend because you're not really alone when you're defending. It's kind of a team effort, and when you can't necessarily sort of depend on your line mates because you don't exactly know what they're going to be doing, it makes it a lot more difficult to actually defend in your zone. One game, Noah Gregor could be playing with Couture and Meyer, and then the next game he could be playing with Lane Peterson and Scott Reedy or something along those lines, which gives a lot of instability to what exactly is his situation. And so it's not necessarily that surprising that his plus minus would take a hit because of that. He just doesn't really know exactly what his teammates are doing. Some teammates will bust out of the zone, some teammates will stay behind and try and defend a bit more, and the same goes for his offensive numbers. But still, I would say it was a slightly above average season here for Noah Gregor because of the fact that he heavily outperformed his career high in terms of points, even if the defensive game kind of lagged behind. And then when it comes to his time on ice, actually a pretty decent amount, which isn't that surprising because while he did play a decent chunk of games on the fourth line, like I mentioned, and in the bottom six, he also played a decent chunk of games in the top six as well, playing with players like Hurdle and Couture. The big thing about Noah Gregor was actually what we had at the end of the season when Thomas Bordeleau came over from college onto the San Jose Sharks. Gregor finally seemed to find a consistent line to play on as he played most of the rest of the last few games of the season with Bordeleau and with Rudolf Balcers on the Sharks' third line, and he really seemed to have a lot of chemistry with Bordeleau. Bordeleau was obviously the big enigmatic factor on that line, but it was actually Rudolf Balcers who was kind of lagging behind the other two, and Gregor seemed to really be a very good complement for Bordeleau. So we'll see if that type of line can actually carry in to the next season. And so when it comes to Noah Gregor's grade, like I said, I thought it was an above average season, not by a ton, but I would say he did outperform my expectations, and as such I gave him the grade of a C+. Class dismissed.